Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Currently Speaking, the podcast of the Current Consulting Group. I'm Bill Current, president and founder of the Current Consulting Group. We encourage you to look at past episodes of Currently Speaking. You can find them on all the major podcast platforms. You can go to our YouTube channel as well, or go to currentconsultinggroup.com and check it out on our website. I'm really excited today because I'm going to be speaking with Greg Henderson. And Greg, I'm going to give you a minute here to tell the audience who you are and et cetera. But I just want to say that Greg Henderson and the Current Consulting Group have entered into a kind of a unique strategic partnership, working together on a lot of different programs and issues. And we're really excited about it. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. But Greg, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Well, Bill, thanks for having me, you and your team, for putting this together. I really appreciate it, and looking forward to, future partnerships and seeing how this goes. And 2026 and beyond is going to be exciting, especially with, some of the topics we're going to start with today. So that's going to just kick off 2026 in itself. But I'm a former FAA Drug and Alcohol Compliance Enforcement Inspector, former Department of Health and Human Services with Department of Interior Drug Program, manager over there, former DOD Department of Defense with the U.S. Army Drug Program Coordinator as well, and former ICE Detention Inspector. And now I'm the owner of Federal Drug Testing Services, which more comprises of training and FAA and HHS consulting.
Well, thank you. And of course, thank you for your service to our country and for the expertise that you now bring to the world of drug testing. And just take a minute, if you would, Greg, to just kind of give us a little bit more background about your experience with the federal regulations.
Well, before I get into, these discussions, I just kind of want to be clear to everybody that I'm coming from, or where my position is that I'm going to be coming from during the podcast, is that I'm sharing my personal professional perspective, not speaking on behalf of the FAA or Department of Transportation or any former, federal employers that I've had. I'm also not speaking as a lawyer or an attorney, or advocating for any policy outcome. My perspective is going to come from program management and compliance, based on my experience managing drug testing programs in the military, enforcing them with the FAA, and drug and alcohol compliance, with helping also implementing federal testing requirements with the Department of Interior. I also want to be very clear that what we're going to talk about today has nothing to do with minimizing safety. Safety has been central to every program I've worked with, and drug testing exists because impairment in safety-sensitive environments carries real consequences. So what I'm going to focus on is how compliance systems remain clear, consistent, and enforceable when upstream policy decisions are made, like the marijuana rescheduling, the expanded researches and all that stuff as it's being introduced. The new executive order, of course, this doesn't change testing rules. But however, I just want everybody to know that federal drug testing is bound to evolve slowly and deliberately, and is by design. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that before we get into, the discussions. And as far as I go, like being a former FAA Drug and Alcohol Compliance Enforcement Inspector, I was the one who kind of was on the team that would go out and look at the files and records of all aviation-related safety-sensitive functions to make sure that they are compliant with 4940 and Part 120 and other advisory circulars. With the Department of Interior, I was one who oversaw drug testing programs for the IRS Criminal Division, the Executive Office of the President. So I literally drug tested the prior two administrations, first the last Obama and the first Trump administration, as well as, oversaw Department of Homeland Security headquarters and Department of Justice and Justice Management Division. So we kind of oversaw those drug testing programs in that. And with the military, it's more of the, unit prevention coordinators with the U.S. Army, which is more of managing their random testing program.
So, well, you mentioned the marijuana rescheduling. Let's talk about that for a minute. I mean, there's been so much discussion about it, opinions being shared, and I like the fact that you added a disclaimer to the beginning of our conversation, because I think that's important for our audience to realize that. But what are some of the key things that you believe employers and others, providers of drug testing services, should understand about the executive order on the rescheduling of marijuana?
Well, I think that the biggest misconception is that there's a lot of overstated risk, being, spread throughout the industry. So I kind of would like to start with that one, is that, at least my top three is that first, there's not going to be a collapse of marijuana testing. Testing doesn't stop simply because rescheduling occurred. Federal programs kind of prioritize safety, and it's not, a criminal classification, so it's not going to be a instant collapse of marijuana testing. The immediate lab certifications are not going to change. The processes are going to remain stable with those. And also it doesn't reduce the safety emphasis. All it is just, should put emphasis on understanding and training on, when that does happen.
So in the time that we've been working together, starting back in December of 2025, so just a month or so ago,
right,
one of the things that has impressed me about your approach to all of this, Greg, and correct me if I've misinterpreted that approach, but I just really appreciate sort of your reasonable, calm approach to advising employers and others on this issue and others, because I think there's sort of a tendency sometimes to maybe overstate the potential negativity of something that happens, whether it's the DOT regulations or HHS or something like that. But I agree with you. I don't think drug testing and testing for marijuana are going away because of this rescheduling.
Right. And I think that, one of the things that I do want to also enforce is the people have to kind of be cautious on where they get their information from and how they receive it and how they internalize it. You have to understand that a lot of things right now is just conversation. And even though you have the executive order, but nothing has made anything final. So I just caution everybody to not change how they're doing their processes right now, because when you do get an audit and investigation or inspection, they're going to come out based upon the current regulations and enforce what is current. So just don't change anything that you're doing. It doesn't change having discussions, but as far as anything concrete, I would virtually say that what should be happening right now, Bill, is what you and other entities out there are doing is educating. That employers will have a lot of questions. They will have a lot of questions, whether you're supervisors, whether you DERs. And also I want to throw in there that there is a separation. I know a lot of you who are listening participate in DOT functions, but there's other entities, which is HHS, Department of Health and Human Services, and Department of Defense, which is the military. So the HHS do not have DERs. They have drug program coordinators. And for the entire government, there's one DER. But for these agencies, they are drug program coordinators. They do not participate in SAP and, things of that nature. And then you have the unit prevention coordinators for the military. So one of the things, the reason why I bring that up is because each one of these entities are going to be affected differently than the other. So that's why it's caution to ensure when you're putting out conversations over the internet, when you're talking about this rescheduling, you have to make sure that you separate between DOT, HHS, and DOD. and as well as federal testing as well. Because if you try to merge this conversation into one, you're going to confuse and lose a lot of people when it comes to the understanding of what the rescheduling is. So what should be happening is vendors who can explain what hasn't changed versus what is going to change. Does that make sense? Like, if you're focusing on what has not changed, then that keeps the confusion down when it comes time for them to get into their compliance or their audits or whatever. Because if they start making changes on what will happen, you can potentially put yourself in a position of a violation of the current regulations and guidelines. So how it should impact the industry is that there should right now be a growth in consulting. There should be a growth in training and policy review, as to, in the event that this is going to happen, what is the policy going to look like, the education point of it, but however, without impacting the current regulations that is out there. So just increase emphasis on communication and documentation support.
Yeah, and let me just, if I could, put a little plug in for us on that. When it comes to policy review and updating, education, et cetera, those are things that Current Consulting Group and Greg Henderson can help you with if you find yourself in need of assistance with that. I do want to come back to something you said about safety, Greg. So every year, the Current Consulting Group conducts 2 surveys. The first one is this year will be our 28th annual drug testing industry survey. And then later in the year, we'll do our 10th annual employer drug testing survey. And in last year's employer drug testing survey, we asked the question, what are the primary motivations for conducting drug testing? And the number one response was safety, to create safer workplaces. And then later in the survey, we asked the question, what are the primary benefits your company realizes from drug testing? And the number one answer was it helps improve safety in our workplace. So safety is clearly front of mind for many employers when it comes to drug testing. A lot of them in safety sensitive industries. They're not all, of course, DOT covered employers. And the majority of drug tests that are conducted in the United States are not DOT mandated tests. But safety is nonetheless a driver or a motivation for drug testing. When you think about drug testing from the perspective of helping employers achieve an objective of safety, where do your thoughts go in terms of what employers should be thinking going forward, especially in light of, the legalization of marijuana? I'm not saying that the rescheduling legalizes marijuana. I'm not saying that, but many states have moved to legalize it on one or another level.
Right. So I think that, and that's a good point, Bill, because that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about was the differences between the federal and the non-federal, testing. That on state level programs, they may diverge further from federal standards, right? So you have a lot of states who are saying, "Oh, marijuana is legal, so we don't have to test for it," and a lot of them need more education and understanding the impact of, removing it from their panel. And that's where, current consultant and stuff like that comes into play as to education on that part. Employers need to be made clear separation between the regulations, the federal workplace, which is, HHS federal employees, and the non-regulated program. So they need to have an increased demand for program segmentation, expertise from you guys, right? So the vendors who blur the lines between state and federal regulations should have a clear and concise separation and more educating on the safety aspect of it and how it's going to impact the outcome of their stakeholders in the event of, the increase of positives or accidents or, those things from the use of marijuana, or the removal of it, or the removal of the testing, portion of it. So I think that when it comes to the safety and this rescheduling, again, is going to go back to where you're getting your information from and how you're internalized, then is going to help you understand your increase in education when it comes to safety.
Yeah, and that's an interesting angle as well, because safety is on the one hand the number one answer that was given as to why you drug test, but it also comes back to each employer's bottom line. You were talking about how these decisions affect all the different stakeholders. Well, some of the stakeholders are your customers, and some of them are your investors or your shareholders, et cetera. And we're all looking for some type of a return on investment from this that's going to make the company profitable and successful. And I think that I don't want to state this in a way that I can't back it up. So as you know, Greg, I just finished writing a book about marijuana called What Every Employer Should Know About Marijuana. And one of the points that I make in there, I devote an entire chapter of the book to how to measure and calculate the return on investment from drug testing and testing for marijuana versus not testing for marijuana. And employers have the right to calculate that into their decision about whether to test for marijuana or whether to drug test at all. And I'll just share one anecdotal episode with you. Recently, I was on the call with a company that we were developing a drug testing policy for. And it was a company that's located in a couple of different states with 1,200 employees. So not a big, giant Fortune 50 type of company, but they do safety sensitive work. And they decided going into the meeting, before they came into the meeting, that they wanted to drop marijuana from their drug test panel. And so we asked the question, and this is my question to you. We asked the question of them, do you want to drop it for pre-employment testing as well as post-accident or reasonable suspicion or random, or just pre-employment testing? In other words, what's your objective? Because we find there are a number of studies in Quest Diagnostics Annual Drug Testing Index would indicate that companies that drop marijuana from their pre-employment drug testing program tend to see an increase in post-accident positivity for marijuana. So one decision really affects a lot of different things when it comes to whether you're going to test and which drugs you're going to test for.
Well, I think that, based on that, when you're talking, and I'm glad that you brought it up, is that they're seeing an increase in other outcomes, right? Like post-accidents, positive test results. And I always say that nothing becomes a problem until there's a positive refusal or an accident. And now that impact is going to come whether you think you're minimizing monetary, you're decreasing your financial responsibility by removing, this from the testing, but you're ultimately going to pay in the end when you increase in positive refusals or accidents along the line. So it's almost like you're taking from Peter paying Paul. kind of thing. So I think, again, it's going to go back to the education portion of it, is that, that's why you have, like I said, you guys who are here to educate on that aspect of it, especially speaking from a federal and a non-federal side, like if you remove it over here on the federal, whatever that may be, how does that now affect? That doesn't mean you can't test it on this side, right? Or whatever the outcome, may be. But I think the increased education from speaking from a safety standpoint is, how does this change safety by removing it? Or is it really, increasing safety concerns or decreasing safety concerns with or without it, because it still impacts a person's impairment.
Yeah.
So again, it's all going to go back to education.
And before we close out this segment on the marijuana issue, can you address sort of the financial angle to the rescheduling of marijuana and banking and things of that nature? Because I keep hearing that coming up all the time.
Well, I think that the rescheduling could lower, the perceived federal risk and open doors over time, but it doesn't fix banking overnight. For banks, it's a reassessment issue. For businesses, it's a patience and compliance issue. And for businesses, like right now is the perceived perception that in the event that this rescheduling happens and they're no longer testing for it, or marijuana becomes federally legal, that all of a sudden, these what do you call them? Not distilleries, but they're dispensaries are now going to have a place to put their money under FDIC, which means that they can tax it and, all this other stuff. So that has been one of the conversations that I've been hearing as well, is that now, we can now take this whole bundle of money and put it in the bank, and now the government can tax it, right? And we're going to tax this money. But right now, the executive order does not mention anything about that, and the FDIC doesn't operate under the perceived executive order. But however, I'm sure that they have their ear to it, but it's going to be on the banks, and the FDIC to make that decision, because it still is a risk, because it's going to be a cash flow, system. And it's like, okay, where's this money really coming from that we're cash flowing it? So that has been, a conversation. So again, it goes back to the thing of where you're getting your information from and how you're internalizing it, because, bad rumors spread fast.
Yeah. So I think what we're going to do, Greg, because I've got another issue I want to bring up with you, but I think it's like a whole new episode. So for our audience, let's call this the end of part 1 with Greg Henderson. And if somebody wants to get a hold of you, Greg, how can they do that?
Well, I got rid of my pigeon system, so they can reach me at federaldrugtesting@gmail.com, or go to my website, federaldrugtestingservices.com.
Excellent. Audience, thank you for joining us for this episode of Currently Speaking. Again, you can check out past episodes at our website, currentconsultinggroup.com, or on any of the major podcast platforms. We're going to close out this episode now, but you're going to see that Greg and I are not going to change our shirts. We're not going to comb our hair differently if we had hair to comb, but we're going to go come back and find us for part 2 of this interview from Greg Henderson. And thank you for joining us. And that concludes today's podcast episode.